Thank you. I hope from the previous talks we had this morning that this does come part way of trying to get people to talk about organ donation in life prior to sort of death, when families are often making very difficult decisions. It's a year since Professor Burrows and I were at the launch of the book Thank You for Life, which finally became a reality 3 years after the original idea. It demonstrates the involvement of everyday people in a project which we hope will make a difference to the number of patients who receive transplantation. We've both been involved with liver transplantation for over 20 years, and we've known patients who have had a huge battle to survive, and with a good liver transplant have made a remarkable recovery. But it's through the generous gift of donors and their families to humanity that makes all of this possible. And we feel desperately that donors do deserve remembrance, recognition, and celebration. Why do we use the letters of our recipients to donors and their families? I think each one expresses a very personal thank you that could be generalised for those families who don't receive letters from their transplant patients. And that's often because the transplant patients find it very difficult to actually write those letters. They often feel that they're recovering, but it's also down to someone who has died. And although they've generously given the organs, they do feel sometimes an element of guilt. It also gives a fantastic picture of the results of transplantation from the transplant patients themselves, not from the health professionals who probably feel that we have to promote it anyway, and we promote it because we have a vested interest to transplant more patients. And we know how powerful these letters are. I think even 20 years post seeing the first letter, I still get moved by those letters that patients have written from the heart to the families of their donors, telling them maybe about what a difference the transplant has made to them and how very much they feel for the families. And I think the patients themselves have permission to write to those patients and express their feelings of understanding of what the donors are going through or the donor families are going through. I don't think there's one patient on the liver transplant waiting list who hasn't at some point felt, what would happen to my family if I die whilst I'm on the waiting list? It's also the first time that a book such as this has been done anywhere in the world, and we felt that hopefully the impact of that would have great resonance on both organ donation and the importance of transplantation. Why the book? We felt that it was a very tangible book that could be sort of given to people, discussed. It could just be picked up and an occasional letter read. And we felt that it was permanent, it continued. It wasn't surrounding transplant or donor days or weeks. It wasn't about special campaigns. And it was a personal decision to pick up that book and have a look at it and read it and discuss it. We also felt that it was a great educational tool to the general public. And that's part of the reason we want it very widely available to anyone. We hope to get it into GP surgeries, hospitals, schools in particular. I think, as Helen has commented, children take transplantation as easily as man going to the moon. They accept it, they understand it, and they're very happy to discuss it openly and honestly with each other, and often can't see the reason not to offer organs for transplantation. And it's also the children that go home to speak to the parents and get the parents talking about not only the child's wish, but also the parents' wish as well, and discussing what their option would be and the decision would be in the event of one of their family members being in the situation, which is quite rare, I have to say, where they have to consider organ donation. We also would like the book to be sort of used by places of worship. As Natalie said, there's no religion that's against organ donation, but it is often down to those religious leaders to actually guide their community to actually agree to things like organ donation and to let them know that it is something that is suitable for them. We also hope that it would facilitate the decision on organ donation. I know that there are books in many ITU relatives' rooms, not to convince them that they have to go ahead with it, but just so that they can pick it up and see what a difference organ donation does make to patients who need transplants. And that if their relative is in the intensive care unit and if the subject of organ donation does come up, that it may be that just one letter that actually helps them make that decision. And I know it's also being used by the donor coordinators and special nurses in organ donation for education, both in hospitals and outside of the hospitals, again, to raise awareness and to get people talking. And it's also a thank you to the families and the donors in recognition of this amazing gift to humanity. And particularly to those families who don't receive letters, to understand and know what it means to have a transplant and how grateful those patients are. So how was it done? Well, I've always had photocopies of many of the letters that were written by our patients, generally and mainly so that if they were lost in transit to the donor coordinators, who then pass the letters on to the families, that we would have a copy, and so we could actually give the family or give the patient that letter to be able to transcribe again if it was lost in the post. We also obviously know a lot of the recipient and donor coordinators, so we have all their contact numbers, so that made it easier as well. The initial stages were to write to a lot of our transplant patients and ask for their consent to publish what was very personal letters to the families of their donors. And the majority of these patients were readily happy to actually give their consent. I think there was only probably one or two who had their concerns. From there, the letters that we had consents from the transplant patients, we then, through the donor coordinators, contacted the families of their donors to see whether they would also be happy to have these letters published. The problems we came up against there was that some of our patients were 10, 20 years post-transplant, and some of the families had moved on. And that was the major problem that we had, with actually contacting the families of the donors. But those families that were contacted, again, most of them wrote back and said that they were happy to give consent. And also a lot of them not only gave their consent, but wrote very encouraging comments on the consent form to say that they felt that this was a very good idea and fully supported it. The Department of Health gave us a limited grant, and they were very keen on the idea and felt that it would be very useful for promotion of organ donation. NHSBT stated that they did have a wish for a book such as this, and also wanted to have some form of donor recognition, and had been looking into that. And also, obviously the donor coordinators are employed by NHSBT, and without their help, we wouldn't have been able to get this done. The Royal College of Physicians were amazing at their support in the book. They helped publish and edit the book. They took our ideas on board, and they've also been very enthusiastic and key in getting the book promoted both nationally and internationally, which has been sort of quite amazing. Barbara Chandler, one of our secretaries, transcribed all the letters, and would come to me often saying, I've been so moved by all of these letters, and would only do so many at a time because they were so emotional for her. Jenny and Victoria took the amazing photographs in the book, and Helen painted the picture that was then used as the focus for the design for the book. At the same time of writing to the patients to ask for their consent for their letters to be published, I also picked out some of our patients who I knew had artistic talent and asked for them to submit any paintings or works of art that they had to include in the book. And the Royal College of Physicians were very impressed by Helen's painting and used that throughout the design of the book. The launch of the book was on the 9th of November 2010, so just over a year ago. It was at the Royal College of Physicians. Anne Milton, the Under-Secretary of Health, was there, as were representatives of the Department of Health, NHSBT, Royal College of Physicians, donor organisations, recipient representatives, and also family representatives from donors. And we also had the painting there in person. So just to go through some of the excerpts from Thank You for Life. I think you can read some of those comments, but they are very personal stories and highlighting very much the importance of family. Susan, her son was 5 years old when she first had her transplant and had been struggling to try and get him to ride a bike on his own. And she said that was one of the key things that she was able to continue after she'd had her transplant and with a lot more energy. This is a lady who had a heart-lung transplant who was from another hospital. We also contacted other recipients who were from sort of the same family donor as some of our liver patients and asked for their consent as well. And I think her comments very much show the treasuring of the simple things in life, which so many of us just take for granted, and how many of us think that it's a joy to actually go to the post office on our own. And also restoring someone's health and pride. As you can see, Steve was sort of suffering from illness. He'd been on benefits. He had also got an 11-month-old child, which, although it's not mentioned here, he said he had a very hard time trying to bond with that child because he kept thinking he may not be here to see it grow up, and he didn't want the child to become too attached to him, just in case he wasn't here to see that child grow up and have the attachments. This family, Mark, he received a kidney transplant. Again, not one of our patients, but the family of his donor received letters from Mark's parents, grandparents, and his sister, Sarah. So I'm sure they were thrilled with that. And it shows how much, organ donation can preserve families as well. And giving grateful thanks. Aislinn sort of says, I wake every day and thank my donor for the gift of life. And that's not an unusual comment. When you read through the letters, so many of the letters say, I think about that person every day. And I think that's a reality. They don't just say that. It's something that they do think about and give thanks for each day. And Diane sort of, although she wants the family to know that they've restored her as a wife and a mother to her husband and children, I don't think she ever dreamt that she would then be reading stories to her grandchildren 14 years post-transplant. Lloyd is a gentleman who attended the launch of the book, and he admits that donating his sister's organs has given him great comfort sort of throughout the years following her donation. She was a 29-year-old girl, and he has campaigned relentlessly, really, to try and encourage people to think about organ donation, to discuss it. He goes to sort of shopping centres and gives information out about organ donation and tries to talk to people so that their wishes can be carried out at the time of death, and also to make it easier on the family. So where does the book go next? We're welcome to any ideas from anyone. We are arranging a meeting for a one-year post-launch for the book to see whether the book has been beneficial for NHSBT, whether we can improve on that. One of my thoughts is that a copy of the book should be at each blood donation session. People who give blood are almost more likely to consent to organ donation as well. But the book may make a difference just reading whilst they have their cup of tea after their donation. We want to sell it. We want to get the book out into the community and into all communities. It's a non-profit making book in that all of the profits that come from the book go back into publishing and printing more of the books to get out to the wider community. We also want to use some of the profits of the books to pay for translation of the book so that it can be used both here and abroad. There's a big interest from South America in the book, so obviously if we could get it printed in Spanish as well, it would very much help things in South America. And we also would encourage any national bookseller to actually take it on as well and promote it. Prof Burrows very much wants recipients, any transplant recipients, to promote it. He asks them to buy two, give one, which is, anyone who knows Professor Burrows, is quite typical. But I have to say it's a good idea in that when the book was published, we did send 2 copies of the books to all of the patients involved and also to the families of the donors involved. And it was, one book was sent as a thank you for them being involved, but the other book was left to their own imagination as to what to do with it. And I had great feedback from that. There was one lady who sent her daughter off to university with a copy of the book. People have taken it to hairdressers, libraries, GP surgeries. And so using that imagination can get the book out just to areas that we wouldn't necessarily send it to get people to talk. We were hoping to show part of a film that had been made about this book. Professor Burrows and I were approached by a lady called Holly Cocker, who's made films in the past, particularly one about a gentleman with cystic fibrosis who was trying to make a decision about whether to have a heart-lung transplant or not. And she very much wanted to sort of use this book to tell people's stories and to film them, produce it into a short documentary, and again, to be able to get it out onto YouTube, any video clip, and maybe radio broadcasts where people could read out the letters and get people's hearts and minds working together. What could be next? National remembrance, recognition and celebration of donors and their families. Again, this was an idea that was launched by Professor Burrows to all of us on the day of the launch of the book. And he felt that we should have a monument and suggested the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square, which he didn't realise the significance at the time, but in fact, Trafalgar Square is a place for unknown heroes. And so it seemed to be the perfect choice to have a sculpture or something in remembrance to what we could say is our 20th and 21st century heroes. There's no issue of age, gender, social status or ethnicity or faith which could sort of have the politically correct people saying that it shouldn't be there. And it's also a universal message of human endeavour. Anne Milton was there, obviously, and so she was put on the spot by Professor Burrows, who admitted that it was a very good idea and worth pursuing. But I have to say she has contacted Boris Johnson since. The plinth is booked up for 2012-2013, and we're not clear whether there are plans for after 2013. And we may need at some point to get signatures on a petition to actually try and encourage them to think about that. We might have to raise money to help promote this. But it could be that one of Helen's ideas is that there could be a competition. She's got lots of contacts in the art world, and there could be a competition to actually design a sculpture or something to be put on the plinth, which would serve as a national monument. And it would be the first time in the world where a country has had a national monument to donors and their families. The recipients tell us, and Thank You for Life, that transplantation is about people and not organs. And the stories tell us that donation is about people and not organs. And what we hope is that people do talk about organ donation. Having worked in ITU many years ago, it's the most difficult decision a family can make at the bedside of someone who's either brainstem dead or they're planning to withdraw treatment from. If the family have discussed it beforehand, then all that the family have to do at that time is to consider the person's wishes and go along and agree with organ donation if that was that person's wishes. They're just carrying out their wishes, and it makes it much easier on the family. So thank you.